Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on an extraordinary journey through the calculated life of Henry Tudor, later known as King Henry VII, England's most coldly efficient monarch who ended 30 years of bloody civil war through sheer cunning and ruthless determination. This is the story of a man who seized a crown on a battlefield, married his enemy's daughter, and ruled England with an iron fist wrapped in financial genius. Henry VII transformed a war-torn kingdom into a stable dynasty through methods that were as brilliant as they were merciless. From his birth in a Welsh castle during a winter storm to his death as England's richest and most feared king, Henry's tale is one of survival, calculation, and the price of absolute power. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Don't be shy. Tell me which part of Henry's cold, calculating nature fascinates you most, or perhaps share your thoughts on how he ended the Wars of the Roses. Did his ruthless methods justify the peace he brought to England? Your gentle comments mean the world to our growing Sleepy Crown family, and I read every single one. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up under your warmest blanket, close your eyes, and let the cold winds of the 15th century England carry you into restful sleep as we explore the mind of history's most calculating king. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Henry, later known as King Henry VII of England, entered this world on a bitter winter's day, January 28th, 1457, within the stone walls of Pembroke Castle in Wales. The very circumstances of his birth seem to foretell the cold, calculating nature that would define his reign. As icy winds howled across the Welsh countryside and snow blanketed the ancient fortress, a child was born who would grow to become England's most ruthlessly efficient monarch. The infant Henry never knew his father's warm embrace. Edmund Tudor, the first Earl of Richmond, had perished of bubonic plague just 3 months before his son's arrival into this harsh world. This early abandonment by death would be the first of many losses that would slowly freeze Henry's heart, teaching him that survival meant trusting no one and depending only on his own cunning mind. His mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, was herself barely more than a child when she gave birth to Henry. At just 13 years old, Margaret endured a labour so traumatic that her attendants feared both mother and child would die in the frigid castle chambers. The physical damage from this ordeal likely prevented her from bearing more children, making Henry her sole focus and obsession for the remainder of her long life. Margaret's fierce, protective love would become both Henry's greatest asset and perhaps the only warmth he would ever truly know. The bloodline that flowed through Henry's veins carried both royal promise and the bitter taste of illegitimacy. Through his mother, he descended from John of Gaunt, the powerful Duke of Lancaster and third son of King Edward III. Yet this claim came tainted by scandal. The Beaufort line sprang from Gaunt's long relationship with his mistress Catherine Swynford, whose children were born outside wedlock and only later legitimised through marriage and royal decree. When King Henry IV had confirmed the legitimacy of the Beaufort children decades earlier, he had added one crucial restriction. They and their descendants were forever barred from inheriting the throne of England. This legal obstacle would haunt Henry throughout his early years, making his eventual claim to the crown seem almost impossible. Yet perhaps this very impossibility began shaping the calculating mind that would one day overcome every obstacle through sheer force of will and cold determination. Henry's earliest memories were formed not in the warmth of a mother's arms, but in the shadows of political upheaval that consumed England during his childhood. The Wars of the Roses had already begun to tear the kingdom apart, as two branches of the royal family, the houses of York and Lancaster, waged bitter warfare for control of the crown. These were not distant conflicts to young Henry. They were the very forces that would shape his destiny and teach him that power was something to be seized and held through any means necessary. Before Henry had even celebrated his first birthday, the harsh realities of political survival forced his separation from his mother. Margaret, understanding that her own safety and future influence depended on remarriage, wed Henry Stafford in early 1458. The infant Henry was left in the care of his uncle Jasper Tudor at Pembroke Castle, beginning a pattern of abandonment and loss that would define his emotional development. Jasper Tudor became more than an uncle to the boy. He was protector, teacher, and the closest thing to a father Henry would ever know. Under Jasper's guidance, Henry received an education befitting his royal blood, learning languages, mathematics, and the arts of war. Yet perhaps more importantly, he absorbed lessons in survival, watching as his uncle navigated the treacherous political waters of a kingdom at war with itself. The safety of Pembroke Castle proved illusory when, in 1461, the Yorkist claimant Edward defeated the Lancastrian forces at the devastating Battle of Towton. This victory secured Edward's position as King Edward IV and marked the beginning of a new reign of terror for remaining Lancastrian supporters. 4-year-old Henry watched as his world crumbled around him, his estates confiscated, his title of Earl of Richmond stripped away and given to Edward's brother. Most painfully for the young boy, his beloved Uncle Jasper was forced to flee into exile to escape Yorkist vengeance. Henry found himself handed over to Sir William Herbert, a Yorkist loyalist who had been granted both Jasper's former estates and guardianship of the dangerous young Lancastrian heir. For the next 8 years, Henry would live as a virtual prisoner, his every move watched, his future uncertain. Life under Herbert's guardianship was not necessarily harsh. The Welsh lord treated Henry with the respect due his royal blood, but it was a constant reminder of his precarious position. Henry learned to mask his true feelings, to present a pleasant facade while his mind catalogued every slight, every threat, every potential ally or enemy. These skills of deception and emotional control would serve him well in the dark years ahead. The young Henry's world shifted again dramatically in 1469 when Sir William Herbert was captured and executed following his defeat at the Battle of Edgecote. For the 12-year-old boy, this represented both liberation and fresh danger. He sought refuge with his mother and her new husband at their estate in Woking, but even this reunion was shadowed by uncertainty about what the future might hold. A brief glimmer of hope appeared in 1470 when the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, temporarily restored Henry VI to the throne. Uncle Jasper returned from exile and brought Henry to court, where for a few precious months it seemed the Lancastrian cause might triumph. Henry witnessed firsthand the pageantry and power of royal court life, but he also observed the fragility of political fortune and the swift brutality with which power could be lost. The restoration proved short-lived. Edward IV returned with Burgundian support in 1471, defeating Warwick at the Battle of Barnet and crushing the final Lancastrian army at Tewkesbury. The young Lancastrian Prince Edward was killed in the battle, and Henry VI himself died mysteriously in the Tower of London shortly afterward, almost certainly murdered on Edward's orders. These deaths eliminated the direct Lancastrian line and left Henry Tudor as the nearest remaining claimant to their cause. Recognising the mortal danger her son now faced, Margaret Beaufort made the agonising decision to send 14-year-old Henry into exile. In the autumn of 1471, uncle and nephew boarded a ship at Tenby and sailed for Brittany, not knowing they would remain in foreign lands for the next 14 years. As the Welsh coast disappeared behind them, Henry left behind his childhood and began the long, cold education that would forge him into England's most calculating king. The journey to Brittany was treacherous, with storms threatening to sink their small vessel before they could reach safety. Perhaps it was during those terrifying hours on the churning seas that Henry first learned to suppress fear through cold analysis, calculating odds and survival strategies while others might have panicked. This ability to remain calm in crisis would become one of his greatest strengths as both exile and king. Duke Francis II of Brittany received the Tudor refugees with cautious hospitality. As a relatively weak ruler caught between the power of France and England, Francis understood the value of keeping potential claimants as diplomatic bargaining chips. He granted Henry and Jasper sanctuary while carefully avoiding any commitment that might provoke Edward IV's wrath. For Henry, this sanctuary came with a price. He was neither prisoner nor guest, but something uncomfortable between the two. The court of Brittany provided Henry with a masterclass in political survival and diplomatic manipulation. He watched as Duke Francis balanced competing pressures from England and France, learning how weakness could be transformed into strength through careful manoeuvring and strategic alliances. These lessons in realpolitik would prove invaluable when Henry eventually faced similar challenges as king. Living under constant threat of extradition to England and certain death, Henry developed the paranoid vigilance that would characterise his entire reign. Every visitor to the Breton court was a potential assassin or kidnapper. Every message from England might contain demands for his surrender, This atmosphere of perpetual danger taught him to trust no one completely and to always maintain multiple escape routes, mental habits that would serve him well but also isolate him from genuine human connection. The loneliness of exile was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Henry's adolescent years. Separated from his mother by hundreds of miles and years of silence, cut off from English lands and English friends, he grew into manhood with only his Uncle Jasper for family. This isolation forced him to become self-reliant to an extreme degree, developing the emotional detachment that would later allow him to make ruthless decisions without being swayed by sentiment or pity. Years passed in Brittany with agonizing slowness. Henry studied languages, military strategy and statecraft, preparing himself for a return to England that seemed increasingly unlikely. Edward IV's reign appeared secure, his dynasty established through multiple sons. Henry's supporters in England died or made their peace with the Yorkist regime, leaving the young exile seemingly forgotten by history. Yet even as his prospects dimmed, Henry never abandoned his ambition to reclaim his birthright. He maintained correspondence with his mother through secret channels, keeping alive the slender networks that connected him to England. Margaret Beaufort, now married to her fourth husband, Lord Stanley, worked tirelessly to preserve her son's interests while carefully avoiding accusations of treason. The death of Edward IV in April 1483 changed everything. News of the king's unexpected demise reached Brittany within days, followed by even more shocking reports of the events unfolding in England. Edward's brother Richard had seized power, declared the late king's children illegitimate, and made himself King Richard III. Most disturbing of all were the rumours that the two young princes, Edward V and his brother Richard, had disappeared from the Tower of London, almost certainly murdered on their uncle's orders. These dramatic developments transformed Henry Tudor from forgotten exile to viable claimant almost overnight. With the direct Yorkist line extinguished and Richard III's legitimacy questionable, English nobles began looking for alternatives. Henry's weak Lancastrian claim suddenly appeared stronger than it had in years, and more importantly, he represented the possibility of uniting the warring factions through marriage to Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter. Margaret Beaufort seized this opportunity with characteristic determination. Working through intermediaries, she began building a coalition of disaffected Yorkists and surviving Lancastrians united in their opposition to Richard III. The keystone of this alliance would be Henry's promise to marry Elizabeth of York, symbolically ending the Wars of the Roses by uniting the rival bloodlines. From his exile in Brittany, Henry watched these developments with growing excitement and calculation. For the first time in his life, the crown of England seemed within reach, not through inheritance or divine right, but through his own effort and the political mistakes of his enemies. The cold, patient young man who had survived years of exile began planning his return with the methodical precision that would characterize his entire reign. The transformation of Henry Tudor from powerless exile to serious claimant marked the end of his youth and the beginning of his emergence as England's most calculating political operator. The lonely, watchful boy who had fled Wales 12 years earlier was becoming the cold-hearted strategist who would soon return to claim a crown through blood and cunning. As 1483 progressed and the coalition against Richard III grew stronger, Henry began preparing for what would be the greatest gamble of his life, an invasion of England with a small army against a crowned king. The success or failure of this venture would determine not only his own fate, but the future direction of English history. The stage was set for the return of the exile, and England would never be the same. The 14 years Henry Tudor spent in exile transformed a desperate refugee into England's most dangerous pretender. During this long period of political purgatory, he learned the arts of survival, manipulation, and cold calculation that would later make him one of Europe's most effective monarchs. These were not wasted years of idle waiting, but a harsh education in realpolitik that stripped away any remaining innocence and forged Henry into a political weapon of devastating efficiency. The court of Duke Francis II provided Henry with a perfect laboratory for studying power in its rawest form. Brittany existed in a precarious position between the growing might of France and the established strength of England, surviving through careful diplomacy and strategic weakness. Duke Francis himself was often ill and subject to the influence of competing advisers, creating a volatile political environment where alliances shifted daily and survival depended on reading the subtle currents of court intrigue. Henry observed everything with the intense focus of a man whose life depended on understanding the mechanics of power. He watched as Francis balanced competing demands from French and English envoys, each seeking to use Brittany for their own purposes. He saw how weakness could be transformed into strength when skillfully managed, and how apparent allies could become deadly enemies overnight. These lessons shaped his understanding that trust was a luxury he could never afford. The constant threat of extradition to England and certain death created an atmosphere of perpetual tension that hardened Henry's nerves and sharpened his political instincts. King Edward IV repeatedly demanded his surrender, sending envoys with increasingly threatening messages and lucrative bribes for the Breton nobles. Each diplomatic crisis became a chess game where Henry's life hung in the balance, teaching him to think several moves ahead and always maintain multiple escape routes. In 1476, these pressures nearly proved fatal when Duke Francis, weakened by illness and swayed by English gold, finally agreed to hand Henry over to Edward IV's agents. The young exile found himself escorted to the port of Saint-Malo, supposedly bound for England and certain execution. In this moment of supreme crisis, Henry displayed the cool thinking and quick wit that would later make him famous. Feigning illness to delay departure, he managed to escape to sanctuary in a local church, buying precious time for Duke Francis to recover and reverse his decision. This near capture taught Henry never to rely entirely on others for his safety. From that moment forward, he maintained his own network of loyal supporters and escape plans, trusting no single protector completely. The paranoid vigilance that would characterize his reign as king began during these dangerous years when survival depended on constant alertness to betrayal and shifting loyalties. The isolation of exile forced Henry to develop remarkable self-discipline and emotional control. Cut off from family, friends, and homeland, he learned to suppress loneliness, homesickness, and despair through sheer force of will. This emotional numbness became both his greatest strength and his deepest tragedy, enabling him to make ruthless decisions without being swayed by sentiment, but also preventing him from forming the warm human connections that might have brought joy to his life. Letters from his mother, Margaret Beaufort, provided Henry's only reliable emotional anchor during these years. Margaret's correspondence, carried by secret messengers at great risk, kept alive his connection to England and his sense of purpose. Through these letters, he learned of political developments at home, the deaths of old enemies and allies, and the gradual shifts in power that might eventually create opportunities for his return. Margaret herself was engaged in a dangerous double game, married to Lord Stanley, a prominent Yorkist noble, while secretly maintaining her son's Lancastrian claim. Her ability to survive and even prosper under successive regimes provided Henry with a model for the political flexibility that would later characterize his own reign. From his mother, he learned that principles were luxuries that political survivors could rarely afford. The years in Brittany also provided Henry with an international perspective that few English nobles possessed. He witnessed firsthand the sophisticated court culture of continental Europe, the complex diplomatic relationships between neighbouring kingdoms, and the emerging importance of trade and finance in determining national power. This broader worldview would later influence his policies as king, particularly his emphasis on commerce and his sophisticated understanding of European politics. Perhaps most importantly, exile taught Henry the supreme value of patience. For 14 years he waited for his opportunity, never abandoning hope but never acting precipitously. He learned to endure frustration, disappointment, and apparent hopelessness while maintaining his readiness to act when the moment was right. This patience would become one of his greatest assets as king, enabling him to pursue long-term strategies that other rulers might have abandoned in favour of immediate gratification. The news of Edward IV's death in April 1483 reached Henry like a bolt of lightning, instantly transforming the political landscape and creating the opportunity he had waited years to exploit. The subsequent usurpation by Richard III and the disappearance of the princes in the Tower shocked Europe and provided Henry with the legitimacy he needed to launch a serious challenge for the English crown. From Brittany, Henry watched the coalition against Richard III take shape with calculating interest. His mother's secret negotiations with Elizabeth Woodville, the formation of an unlikely alliance between former enemies, and the promise of marriage to Elizabeth of York all combined to create the strongest position any Lancastrian claimant had enjoyed in over a decade. For the first time since fleeing England as a boy, Henry began to believe that return was not only possible but likely. The failed rebellion of October 1483, led by the Duke of Buckingham, provided Henry with crucial intelligence about Richard III's strengths and weaknesses. Though the uprising collapsed before Henry could land his supporting army, the attempt revealed which English nobles were willing to risk everything to overthrow the usurper king. Many of these failed rebels fled to join Henry in Brittany, bringing fresh information about conditions in England and swelling his small court of exiles. Among these refugees was John Morton, Bishop of Ely, whose political acumen and connections proved invaluable to Henry's cause. Morton brought not only his own considerable talents, but also detailed knowledge of the English Church's attitude toward Richard III and the growing opposition to the king's rule. Through Morton and others, Henry began building the intelligence network that would be crucial to his eventual success. The presence of so many English exiles in Brittany also created new dangers for Henry. Richard III's agents worked tirelessly to infiltrate the exile community, seeking opportunities for assassination or kidnapping. Henry was forced to become even more suspicious and careful, trusting no one completely and always watching for signs of betrayal. This atmosphere of constant vigilance further hardened his already cold demeanour and reinforced his conviction that survival depended on maintaining emotional distance from even his closest supporters. In 1484, Duke Francis's illness provided Richard III with another opportunity to eliminate his most dangerous rival. The king's agents negotiated with Pierre Landais, the Breton treasurer who held effective power during Francis's incapacity, offering military aid against France in exchange for Henry's extradition. Once again, Henry's life hung by a thread, and once again his network of supporters proved their worth by warning him of the danger in time to escape. The flight from Brittany to France marked a crucial turning point in Henry's career. King Charles VIII of France welcomed the English exile as a useful tool against Richard III, providing him with money, soldiers, and a base for planning his invasion of England. For the first time since childhood, Henry found himself supported by a major European power, transforming him from desperate refugee to serious contender for the English throne. The French court provided Henry with resources he had never before possessed: sufficient funds to hire professional soldiers, diplomatic recognition that legitimised his claim, and access to the military expertise needed to plan a successful invasion. Under French protection, he could focus entirely on preparing for his return to England without constantly watching for assassins or kidnappers. Yet even as his prospects improved dramatically, Henry remained the same cold, calculating individual that exile had created. Success had not softened his suspicions or warmed his emotional responses. If anything, the approach of his greatest gamble made him even more careful and methodical. He planned his invasion with the precision of a master chess player, considering every possible move and countermove, preparing for every contingency that might arise. The months of preparation in France revealed Henry's emerging genius for organisation and strategic thinking. He coordinated with his supporters in England, arranged for supplies and transport, recruited soldiers and officers, and planned the complex logistics of amphibious invasion. Every detail received his personal attention, from the composition of his army to the timing of his landing, demonstrating the obsessive attention to detail that would later characterise his administration as king. As the summer of 1485 approached, Henry Tudor had been transformed by 14 years of exile, from a desperate boy into a formidable political and military leader. The cold calculation that had enabled him to survive years of danger and uncertainty now focused on the greatest challenge of his life, the conquest of England, and the throne that had seemed impossibly distant when he first fled as a child. The lessons learned during his long exile would serve Henry well in the trials ahead. He had learned to trust no one completely, to prepare for every contingency, to mask his true feelings behind a calm facade, and to pursue his goals with relentless patience and determination. These qualities, forged in the harsh school of political survival, would soon make him one of England's most effective kings. The time for waiting had ended. Henry Tudor, shaped by loss and hardened by exile, was ready to return home and claim his inheritance through whatever means necessary. England awaited the arrival of its most calculating king, though few could have imagined the cold efficiency with which he would rule once the crown was his. The return of Henry Tudor to English soil in August 1485 marked the beginning of one of history's most calculated and methodical conquests. Every aspect of the invasion was planned with the cold precision that had enabled Henry to survive 14 years of exile, and every decision was made with the ruthless efficiency that would later characterize his reign. This was not the desperate gamble of an ambitious pretender, but the carefully orchestrated campaign of a political genius who had learned to transform weakness into strength through superior planning and ice-cold determination. Henry's choice of landing site revealed his strategic brilliance. Rather than attempting to reach the English coast at the most convenient point, he sailed his small fleet to Mill Bay near Dale in Pembrokeshire, the very region where he had been born and where his family still commanded loyalty. This symbolic return to his birthplace was calculated to inspire both his own forces and potential Welsh recruits, while the remote location reduced the risk of immediate interception by Richard III's forces. The army that disembarked on Welsh soil on August 7, 1485, was pitifully small by the standards of medieval warfare. Perhaps 2,000 men, mostly French and Scottish mercenaries with a corps of English exiles who had fled Richard's regime. Yet Henry understood that numbers alone would not determine the outcome of his campaign. Victory would depend on his ability to recruit additional forces while preventing Richard from bringing his full strength to bear against the invasion. Henry's first steps on English soil after 14 years of exile were carefully choreographed for maximum psychological impact. According to witnesses, he fell to his knees and kissed the ground, reciting Psalm 43, "Judge me, O God, and plead my cause against an ungodly nation." This display of pious humility was perfectly calculated to contrast with Richard III's reputation for ruthless ambition, presenting Henry as a righteous claimant blessed by divine providence. The march inland from the Pembrokeshire coast became a masterclass in political manipulation and psychological warfare. Henry moved slowly and deliberately, allowing time for word of his arrival to spread and for potential supporters to join his cause. At every village and town his heralds proclaimed him the rightful King of England, come to restore justice and end the tyranny of the usurper Richard. These proclamations were crafted with careful attention to their audience, emphasizing themes of legitimacy, divine blessing, and liberation from oppression. Henry's greatest challenge during the Welsh phase of his campaign was winning over Sir Rhys ap Thomas, the most powerful Welsh nobleman and Richard III's appointed lieutenant in Wales. Rhys commanded thousands of men whose allegiance could determine the success or failure of the entire invasion. In negotiations that demonstrated his emerging genius for political manipulation, Henry offered Rhys the lieutenancy of all Wales in exchange for his support, a promise that transformed a potential enemy into a crucial ally. The recruitment of Rhys ap Thomas and his followers provided Henry with his first significant reinforcement, swelling his army to perhaps 5,000 men. More importantly, it demonstrated to other potential supporters that joining Henry's cause offered rewards rather than merely risks. The careful balance of threats and promises that secured Rhys's allegiance would become a hallmark of Henry's political method throughout his reign. As the Tudor army moved eastward through Wales, Henry's agents worked tirelessly to spread propaganda favourable to their cause while gathering intelligence about Richard's response to the invasion. These early demonstrations of Henry's sophisticated understanding of information warfare reveal the influence of his continental education and his appreciation for the psychological dimensions of political conflict. The crossing into England marked a crucial escalation in Henry's campaign. No longer could he claim to be merely visiting his ancestral lands. By entering Shropshire with an armed force, he had committed himself irrevocably to rebellion against the crowned king. This moment tested the cold resolve that had sustained him through years of exile, and Henry passed the test without visible emotion, maintaining the calm facade that would become his trademark. The march through the English countryside revealed Henry's sophisticated understanding of medieval military logistics and his meticulous attention to detail. His army moved with disciplined efficiency, avoiding the pillaging and destruction that might have alienated potential supporters, while maintaining the speed necessary to prevent Richard from organising an overwhelming response. Supply lines were carefully managed, scouts ranged far ahead to gather intelligence, and diplomatic contacts were maintained with potential allies along the route. Perhaps the most delicate aspect of Henry's campaign was his relationship with the Stanley family, whose support could prove decisive in any confrontation with Richard III. Thomas Stanley was Henry's stepfather through his marriage to Margaret Beaufort, but he was also a prominent member of Richard's court and had given public oaths of loyalty to the king. William Stanley, Thomas's brother, commanded significant forces in the region, but had remained carefully neutral despite secret communications with Henry's agents. The negotiations with the Stanleys revealed Henry at his most calculating and patient. Rather than demanding immediate commitment, he allowed them to maintain their ambiguous position, while gradually building pressure for them to choose sides. This strategy recognised that premature demands might drive them into Richard's camp, while patient cultivation of their self-interest might eventually secure their crucial support. Meanwhile, Richard III was responding to the invasion with characteristic energy and determination. Despite his reputation for ruthlessness, Richard remained personally brave and possessed considerable military experience. He moved quickly to concentrate his forces while sending urgent summons to nobles throughout England to join him in crushing the rebellion. The king's response demonstrated that Henry faced a formidable opponent who would not be easily defeated. The news that Richard was advancing with a substantial army might have demoralised a less resolute commander, but Henry received these reports with the same cold calculation that had characterised his entire campaign. He had always known that victory would require defeating Richard in battle. The only question was whether the circumstances of that battle would favour his smaller but potentially more motivated force. As the two armies converged on the area around Market Bosworth in Leicestershire, Henry demonstrated the strategic patience that had sustained him through years of exile. Rather than seeking immediate battle, he positioned his forces carefully while continuing his efforts to secure additional support and gather intelligence about Richard's dispositions and intentions. The final negotiations before battle revealed Henry's willingness to gamble everything on his reading of political psychology. His agents maintained contact with potential defectors in Richard's army, while he himself held secret meetings with the Stanleys to coordinate their eventual intervention. These discussions required enormous courage, as discovery would have meant immediate execution. But Henry's cold nerve never faltered. On the night before battle, as both armies prepared for what might prove to be the decisive engagement of the Wars of the Roses, Henry Tudor remained outwardly calm and confident. Witnesses later reported that he showed no signs of fear or uncertainty, maintaining the icy self-control that had become his hallmark. Inside, he may have felt the weight of 15 years of preparation culminating in a single day's fighting, but he revealed nothing of these emotions to his followers. The morning of August 22nd, 1485, dawned clear and relatively warm, providing excellent conditions for the battle that would determine England's future. As Henry prepared his small army for combat against a larger royal force, he embodied the cold resolution and calculating intelligence that had brought him from exile to the threshold of kingship. Win or lose, he had demonstrated that patience, preparation, and superior political strategy could transform the most unpromising circumstances into genuine opportunity. The Battle of Bosworth Field would test every lesson Henry had learned during his long years of exile and preparation. The cold-hearted pretender who had survived assassination attempts, diplomatic betrayals, and years of uncertainty was about to discover whether his calculated approach to warfare could succeed against the established might of a crowned king. England awaited the outcome of this confrontation between the usurper and the exile, not knowing that the result would establish one of its most effective dynasties. The battle itself unfolded with the same careful calculation that had characterized Henry's entire campaign. Rather than relying on desperate courage or military brilliance, he positioned his forces to maximize their advantages while minimizing their weaknesses. The Earl of Oxford commanded Henry's main battle line with strict instructions to maintain formation and avoid the disordered melees that might favour Richard's more numerous forces. As the battle developed, Henry's superior political preparation began to tell. His patient cultivation of potential defectors within Richard's army paid dividends as key commanders hesitated to commit their full strength against him. Most crucially, the Stanley forces remained ominously neutral, their large army positioned to intervene decisively once the tide of battle became clear. The climactic moment came when Richard III, recognising that his political support was crumbling, launched a desperate cavalry charge aimed at killing Henry personally and ending the battle through a single decisive stroke. This dramatic gesture revealed both Richard's personal courage and his failure to understand the psychological dimensions of the conflict he was fighting. Henry's response to Richard's charge demonstrated the cold calculation that had brought him this far. Rather than fleeing or meeting the charge directly, he positioned himself to draw Richard away from his. supporting forces while his own bodyguard and allied cavalry prepared to intervene. This moment of supreme danger tested every quality that Exile had developed in him: courage, calculation, and the ability to remain calm under ultimate pressure. The intervention of William Stanley's forces at the crucial moment sealed Richard's fate and Henry's victory. As the last Plantagenet king died fighting in the mud of Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor became King of England through the same cold efficiency that had characterised his entire campaign. The crown that was reportedly placed on his head at the battle site symbolised not just military victory, but the triumph of superior political strategy over traditional royal power. In the immediate aftermath of victory, Henry's first actions as king revealed the calculating mind that would govern England for the next 24 years. Rather than celebrating or showing emotion, he immediately began organising his new government, issuing pardons to former enemies while rewarding his supporters. The cold efficiency of these first decisions established the tone for a reign that would transform England through methodical reform rather than dramatic gesture. The conquest of England was complete, but Henry understood better than most that winning a throne was easier than keeping it. The lessons learned during his long exile: trust no one completely, prepare for every contingency, and maintain constant vigilance against threats, would guide him through the challenges of kingship, just as they had sustained him through years of danger and uncertainty. The coronation of Henry VII on October 30th, 1485, marked the beginning of one of England's most coldly efficient reigns. The man who placed the crown on his head in Westminster Abbey was no longer the desperate exile who had fled England 14 years earlier, but a calculating political machine whose every decision would be measured against its potential to strengthen his hold on power and secure his dynasty's future. The warmth and emotion that most new kings might have felt at achieving their life's ambition seemed entirely absent from Henry's demeanour, replaced instead by the icy determination to transform his battlefield victory into lasting political dominance. Henry's first crucial decision as king revealed the calculating mind that would characterise his entire reign. Despite his solemn promise to marry Elizabeth of York, made in Wren Cathedral on Christmas Day, 1483, he deliberately delayed the wedding for nearly 5 months after his coronation. This delay was not romantic hesitation, but cold political calculation. Henry was determined to establish himself as king in his own right, ruling by conquest and hereditary claim, rather than merely as the husband of a Yorkist princess. The eventual wedding ceremony on January 18th, 1486, was a masterpiece of political theatre carefully orchestrated to serve Henry's dynastic ambitions. Every detail was calculated. For maximum psychological impact, the magnificent pageantry proclaimed the strength and legitimacy of the new Tudor regime, while the symbolic union of the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster promised an end to decades of civil war. Yet beneath this display of romantic unity lay Henry's cold assessment that Elizabeth was more valuable as a political asset than as a wife. Elizabeth of York herself proved to be an ideal partner for Henry's calculating approach to monarchy. Beautiful, intelligent, and genuinely popular with the English people, she provided the Yorkist legitimacy that Henry's weak Lancastrian claim required, while apparently harbouring no political ambitions of her own. The marriage appears to have been genuinely affectionate, though Henry's emotional coldness meant that even his closest relationship remained shaped by political calculation rather than spontaneous warmth. The birth of Prince Arthur on September 20th, 1486, just 8 months after the royal wedding, provided Henry with the male heir he desperately needed, while silencing critics who might have questioned the marriage's legitimacy. The timing was so convenient that rumours circulated suggesting Elizabeth had been pregnant before the wedding, rumours that Henry neither confirmed nor denied, understanding that the appearance of divine blessing on his dynasty was more important than conventional propriety. Henry's choice of name for his heir revealed his sophisticated understanding of political symbolism and his determination to establish the Tudor dynasty as the fulfilment of English destiny. Arthur evoked the legendary king whose return had long been prophesied, while the choice to have the prince born at Winchester, traditionally associated with the Arthurian legends, reinforced the message that the Tudors represented England's glorious future, rather than merely another change of dynasty. The early years of Henry's reign were dominated by his methodical destruction of remaining Yorkist claimants and potential threats to his throne. This campaign of elimination was conducted with the same cold efficiency that had characterised his conquest, but it revealed a new dimension to Henry's ruthlessness, the calculated cruelty of a man who understood that mercy toward rivals was a luxury he could not afford. The first major test of Henry's resolve came with Lambert's Simnel's rebellion in 1487. The 10-year-old boy, coached by Yorkist conspirators to impersonate the Earl of Warwick, represented exactly the kind of threat that Henry's cold logic told him must be crushed without mercy. Yet Henry's response revealed the sophisticated political thinking that distinguished him from his predecessors. Rather than simply executing the child pretender after his capture at the Battle of Stoke, Henry employed him as a servant in the royal kitchens, a gesture of calculated mercy designed to demonstrate his magnanimity while humiliating his enemies. This treatment of Simnel established a pattern that would characterize Henry's reign: ruthless elimination of genuine threats combined with carefully calculated displays of mercy toward those who posed no real danger. The boy pretender's survival served Henry's purposes by proving that the real Earl of Warwick remained safely imprisoned in the Tower, while his menial employment sent a clear message about the fate awaiting future pretenders. The more serious challenge posed by Perkin Warbeck revealed Henry's capacity for patient, methodical destruction of his enemies. For nearly a decade, from 1491 to 1499, Warbeck claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger of the princes in the Tower. Unlike the easily exposed Simnel, Warbeck possessed sufficient resemblance to the missing prince and enough sophistication to convince several European courts of his legitimacy, making him a far more dangerous threat to Henry's security. Henry's response to the Warbeck threat demonstrated the evolution of his political method, from the direct action of his conquest to the subtle manipulation that would characterize his mature reign. Rather than attempting to capture or kill Warbeck immediately, Henry systematically undermined his support by exposing his true identity, bribing his allies, and demonstrating the futility of opposing the established Tudor regime. This patient approach required enormous self-discipline from a king whose every instinct urged immediate action against threats to his throne. The financial cost of suppressing the Warbeck rebellion, over £13,000, an enormous sum for the period, taught Henry lessons about the relationship between money and power that would shape his later policies. He began to understand that a king's security depended not just on military strength or political alliances, but on the financial resources necessary to sustain both loyalty and resistance to enemies. This insight would drive his later obsession with accumulating wealth and his development of the most efficient tax collection system in European history. The execution of Warbeck in 1499 marked the end of serious Yorkist resistance to Henry's rule, but it also revealed the cold calculation that governed all his political decisions. Warbeck's death came only after Henry had extracted maximum political advantage from his captivity, using the pretender's presence in the Tower to justify increased security measures and higher taxes while gradually eliminating his remaining supporters. The timing of the execution, coinciding with the death of the real Earl of Warwick, eliminated the last viable Yorkist claimants in a single stroke. The decision to execute the Earl of Warwick alongside Warbeck demonstrated Henry's understanding that half measures were more dangerous than ruthless thoroughness. Warwick, though mentally disabled and politically harmless, represented a potential focus for future Yorkist conspiracies simply by virtue of his bloodline. Henry's willingness to execute an innocent man revealed the complete subordination of personal conscience to political necessity that would characterize his entire reign. Throughout these early crises, Elizabeth of York provided Henry with crucial legitimacy and stability. Her very presence at court served as a constant reminder that the Wars of the Roses had ended through marriage rather than conquest, while her popularity with the English people helped offset Henry's reputation for coldness and calculation. Yet even this most intimate relationship remained shaped by political considerations rather than pure affection. The royal couple's apparent happiness together masked the reality that Elizabeth remained essentially a political prisoner, albeit a privileged one. Her movements were carefully monitored, her correspondence read, and her contacts limited to those approved by Henry's security apparatus. This treatment reflected not personal cruelty, but Henry's understanding that even beloved wives could become focuses for political opposition, if not carefully managed. The birth of additional children, Margaret in 1489, Henry in 1491, and Mary in 1496, strengthened the Tudor dynasty while providing Henry with additional tools for diplomatic manipulation. Each royal child represented a potential marriage alliance that could secure foreign support or neutralize external threats. Henry's cold assessment of his children's value as diplomatic assets would later drive his marriage negotiations with the same ruthless efficiency that characterized all his political calculations. The establishment of royal progresses throughout England during these years revealed another dimension of Henry's political genius. These carefully orchestrated journeys combined practical governance with sophisticated propaganda, allowing Henry to demonstrate royal power while gathering intelligence about local conditions and potential threats. Every stop was planned with military precision, every ceremony designed to reinforce messages about Tudor legitimacy and power. Henry's treatment of the nobility during his early reign established the foundations for the system of control that would dominate his later years. Rather than destroying potential rivals outright, he preferred to bind them through bonds, recognizances, and financial obligations that made rebellion economically ruinous. This system required constant surveillance and record-keeping, creating the bureaucratic apparatus that would later enable Henry's transformation into Europe's most efficient absolute monarch. The development of Henry's spy network during these years represented perhaps his greatest innovation in the art of medieval kingship. Drawing on lessons learned during his exile, when survival had depended on superior intelligence, Henry created the most sophisticated surveillance system in European history. Every major nobleman, merchant and cleric found their activities monitored by agents whose loyalty was secured through a combination of rewards and threats. The death of Prince Arthur in 1502 tested Henry's emotional control as nothing had before. Contemporary witnesses reported that the normally impassive king broke down completely upon hearing the news, screaming and sobbing with grief that shocked courtiers accustomed to his icy demeanour. Yet even in this moment of supreme personal anguish, Henry's political instincts remained active, immediately beginning the process of securing his dynasty's future through his surviving son. The subsequent death of Elizabeth of York in 1503, dying from complications following the birth of a daughter, who survived only days, completed Henry's transformation into the cold, isolated figure who would dominate the final years of his reign. The loss of his wife and heir within months of each other stripped away whatever emotional warmth had survived his early experiences of loss and betrayal, leaving only the calculating political machine that would terrorize England for the remainder of his life. Henry's brief consideration of remarriage following Elizabeth's death revealed the complete subordination of personal feeling to political calculation that now governed his decisions. Various princesses were evaluated solely on the basis of their potential to provide heirs and strengthen diplomatic alliances, with no apparent consideration for personal compatibility or affection. The fact that these negotiations ultimately came to nothing reflected not romantic sentiment, but Henry's assessment that the political benefits did not justify the risks. The final years of Henry's reign saw the full flowering of the cold efficiency that had always characterized his approach to kingship. With dynastic rivals eliminated and domestic opposition crushed, he turned his attention to the systematic extraction of wealth from his subjects through legal mechanisms that were technically legitimate, but practically indistinguishable from extortion. This campaign of financial oppression would define his legacy and shape English attitudes toward royal power for generations. The transformation of Henry VII from exiled pretender to absolute monarch represented one of history's most successful examples of political calculation triumphing over traditional sources of legitimacy. Through patience, cunning, and ruthless efficiency, he had built the foundation for what would become England's greatest dynasty. Yet the cost of this success was measured not only in the lives of his enemies, but in the warmth and humanity that his own survival had required him to sacrifice. As Henry entered the final phase of his reign, he had achieved everything he had dreamed of during his long years of exile: security, wealth, and dynastic continuity. Yet the methods that had brought him success had also isolated him from genuine human connection, creating a lonely and suspicious king whose trust extended to no one, and whose mercy existed only when it served his political interests. The cold-hearted king who had ended the Wars of the Roses through marriage and manipulation was about to demonstrate just how ruthless absolute power could become when wielded by a man who had learned to subordinate every human feeling to the demands of political survival. The systematic creation of England's first modern surveillance state represented perhaps Henry VII's most innovative and terrifying achievement. Drawing upon lessons learned during his 14 years of exile, when survival had depended on superior intelligence and the ability to detect threats before they materialized, Henry constructed a network of spies, informants, and bureaucrats that penetrated every level of English society. This apparatus of control was unprecedented in its scope and efficiency, transforming England from a feudal kingdom into something approaching a police state centuries before such concepts were supposed to exist. The foundations of Henry's surveillance system were laid during his first years as king, when the constant threat of Yorkist rebellion made intelligence gathering a matter of survival. Initially focused on detecting conspiracies and preventing invasions, the network gradually expanded to monitor all aspects of English life that might affect royal security or revenue. By the end of his reign, no significant transaction, journey, or conversation could occur without some record reaching the king's agents. Henry's personal involvement in the development of this system revealed the obsessive attention to detail that characterized all his political innovations. He personally reviewed reports from his agents, maintained his own coded correspondence with key informants, and developed the filing systems that enabled efficient processing of the enormous volume of intelligence his network generated. This hands-on approach ensured that the surveillance apparatus served his purposes rather than developing its own agenda. The recruitment of agents demonstrated Henry's sophisticated understanding of human motivation and his willingness to exploit every weakness and ambition to serve his purposes. Rather than relying solely on traditional royal servants, he cultivated informants among merchants, clerics, servants, and even beggars, anyone whose position provided access to useful information. The promise of royal favour, protection from prosecution, or simple monetary reward proved sufficient to recruit collaborators at every level of society. The most insidious aspect of Henry's surveillance state was its use of seemingly legitimate institutions to gather intelligence. Tax collectors became informants reporting on the wealth and activities of their targets. Justices of the peace found their appointments conditional on providing regular reports about local conditions. Even the royal progress became an intelligence-gathering exercise, with courtiers carefully noting the reactions of local populations and identifying potential sources of discontent. The development of a sophisticated record-keeping system enabled Henry to transform raw intelligence into actionable political knowledge. Every significant noble family found their finances, alliances, and personal habits documented in files that could be consulted whenever decisions needed to be made about appointments, marriages, or potential threats. This bureaucratic innovation represented a fundamental shift from personal rule based on relationships to systematic governance based on information. Henry's use of financial pressure as a tool of surveillance and control demonstrated his understanding that modern kingship required different methods than traditional feudal authority. Through bonds, recognizances, and selective prosecutions, he could ruin any subject who threatened his interests while maintaining the appearance of legal propriety. The constant threat of financial destruction ensured cooperation even from those who might otherwise have risked rebellion. The integration of foreign intelligence into Henry's domestic surveillance network revealed his appreciation for the international dimensions of royal security. Agents in European courts provided advance warning of diplomatic developments that might affect England, while merchants engaged in international trade supplied information about foreign military preparations and political conditions. This global perspective enabled Henry to anticipate and counter threats that might otherwise have surprised him. The psychological impact of Henry's surveillance state may have been even more important than its practical intelligence gathering. The knowledge that royal agents were everywhere created an atmosphere of suspicion and self-censorship that discouraged opposition before it could organize. Potential rebels found themselves unable to trust anyone completely, while the general population learned to monitor their own words and actions to avoid attracting unwanted royal attention. The role of Margaret Beaufort in developing and managing the surveillance apparatus demonstrated the family loyalty that remained Henry's only genuine emotional attachment. His mother's network of correspondents and supporters, built up during decades of political manoeuvring, provided the foundation for much of the king's intelligence system. Margaret's ability to maintain contacts across factional lines made her an invaluable asset in monitoring potential threats. The use of the church as a surveillance tool revealed Henry's willingness to subordinate even religious institutions to his security requirements. bishops and abbots found their appointments contingent on providing information about their flocks, while the confessional became a potential source of intelligence about political opinions and activities. This penetration of religious life demonstrated the totalitarian tendencies inherent in Henry's approach to kingship. The development of specialised courts and legal procedures to process intelligence, information enabled Henry to act on his agents' reports while maintaining an appearance of due process. The Court of Star Chamber, revived and expanded during his reign, provided a venue for dealing with cases that required secrecy or speed. These proceedings often relied on evidence gathered through surveillance, creating a system where royal intelligence could be transformed into legal punishment. The training and management of agents required unprecedented attention to the human resources of government. Henry developed systems for recruiting, supervising, and rewarding his informants that ensured their continued loyalty while protecting their identities. The creation of multiple parallel networks provided redundancy and prevented any single agent from becoming too powerful or knowledgeable about the entire system. The extension of surveillance to foreign merchants and visitors demonstrated Henry's recognition that threats could emerge from unexpected sources. Italian bankers, Flemish traders, and other foreigners found their activities monitored as carefully as those of English subjects. This xenophobic approach reflected both practical security concerns and Henry's personal paranoia about foreign influence on English affairs. The integration of surveillance into routine governance made intelligence gathering a normal part of royal administration rather than an emergency response to crisis. Tax assessments included reports on political attitudes, judicial proceedings generated information about local conditions, and military musters provided opportunities to evaluate the loyalty and capability of potential enemies. This systematization ensured that intelligence flowed continuously, rather than only during periods of heightened tension. The use of surveillance to identify and exploit the personal weaknesses of potential enemies demonstrated Henry's ruthless approach to political manipulation. Knowledge of gambling debts, sexual indiscretions, or family conflicts could be used to coerce cooperation or justify punishment. This personal dimension of intelligence gathering made the surveillance state particularly intrusive and psychologically oppressive. The protection of the surveillance apparatus through legal immunities and special privileges ensured its continued effectiveness despite occasional exposure or public criticism. Agents enjoyed royal protection from prosecution for their intelligence-gathering activities, while the revelation of their identities was treated as treason against the crown. These protections encouraged aggressive intelligence collection, while deterring interference from local authorities. The legacy of Henry's surveillance innovations extended far beyond his own reign, establishing precedents and methods that would be refined by later Tudor monarchs. The techniques developed for monitoring political opposition would prove equally effective for identifying religious dissent, while the bureaucratic structures created for processing intelligence would evolve into the sophisticated administrative systems of early modern England. The moral cost of Henry's surveillance state was measured not only in the loss of privacy and freedom experienced by his subjects, but in the psychological damage inflicted on the king himself. The constant flow of reports about plots, criticisms, and disloyalty reinforced his natural paranoia and prevented him from forming genuine relationships with anyone outside his immediate family. The very success of his intelligence apparatus ensured his isolation from the human warmth that might have provided some relief from the burdens of absolute power. As Henry's reign progressed toward its final years, the surveillance state he had created began to take on a life of its own, generating ever more detailed reports about ever more trivial matters while consuming increasing resources and attention. The system that had begun as a tool for ensuring dynastic survival had evolved into an end in itself, reflecting the fundamental transformation of English monarchy from personal rule to bureaucratic control that would characterise the Tudor century. The transformation of Henry VII from a calculating but still recognisably human king into the cold, isolated tyrant of his final years can be traced to two devastating personal losses that occurred within months of each other in 1502 and 1503. The deaths of Prince Arthur and Queen Elizabeth of York did not merely remove beloved family members from Henry's life. They destroyed the last vestiges of warmth and human connection that had survived his harsh journey from exile to absolute power. What remained was a brilliant but emotionally dead political machine, capable of ruling England with unprecedented efficiency, but incapable of the basic human sympathies that might have made his rule bearable for his subjects. The death of Prince Arthur on April 2nd, 1502 at Ludlow Castle struck Henry with the force of a physical blow. Contemporary witnesses reported that the normally impassive king's reaction was shocking in its intensity. He collapsed completely, screaming and sobbing with grief that seemed to pour out from some deep well of emotion that his subjects had never suspected existed. For perhaps the first time since becoming king, Henry's iron self-control shattered completely, revealing the profound love he had felt for the son who represented both his dynastic hopes and his own personal redemption. Arthur had been everything Henry could have hoped for in an heir: intelligent, capable, and genuinely popular with the English people. More importantly for the emotionally guarded king, Arthur had represented the possibility that the Tudor dynasty might be ruled by a warmer, more naturally sympathetic monarch than himself. In his son, Henry had glimpsed the possibility that his own sacrifices might produce something better than mere survival and control. The prince's death from what contemporary physicians called the sweating sickness came without warning, transforming joy into anguish with the same cruel suddenness that had characterized so many turning points in Henry's life. The young man who had embodied the future of the Tudor dynasty was dead at 15, leaving his parents to grapple with grief that threatened to overwhelm even their extraordinary reserves of self-discipline. Elizabeth of York's response to Arthur's death revealed depths of feeling that matched her husband's, though she maintained better outward composure. According to court witnesses, she comforted Henry in his initial breakdown with gentle words about divine providence and the continuation of their line through their surviving children. Her strength in this moment of crisis demonstrated the genuine partnership that had developed between the royal couple despite the political calculations that had originally brought them together. Yet beneath Elizabeth's brave words lay her own devastating grief and a growing understanding that Arthur's death had fundamentally altered the dynamics of their marriage and their kingdom. With Prince Henry now heir to the throne, the succession was secure, but the careful balance between Yorkist and Lancastrian legitimacy that Arthur had represented was gone forever. The future Tudor dynasty would be shaped by the surviving prince's personality rather than the more balanced character that Arthur had promised. The Queen's final pregnancy, beginning in late 1502, represented both hope and danger for the grieving royal couple. At 36, Elizabeth was already considered old for childbearing by medieval standards, and the emotional stress of Arthur's death had taken a visible toll on her health. Yet the possibility of another son offered the tantalizing prospect of restoring the dynasty's security, while perhaps providing some consolation for the loss they had suffered. Henry's reaction to his wife's pregnancy revealed the calculating mind that continued to function even amid personal anguish. While genuinely concerned for Elizabeth's welfare, he could not help but consider the political implications of another child. A healthy son would strengthen the succession, while a daughter might provide valuable marriage alliance opportunities. Even in his darkest personal moments, the king's political instincts remained active. The birth of Princess Catherine on February 2nd, 1503, initially seemed to offer some hope for the grieving royal family. The child appeared healthy, and Elizabeth's successful delivery suggested that she might yet provide additional heirs. For a brief moment it seemed possible that the Tudors might recover from Arthur's death stronger than before, with a surviving heir and renewed prospects for dynastic expansion. The illusion of recovery lasted only days. Princess Catherine died on February 11th, and Elizabeth herself succumbed to puerperal fever on her 37th birthday. In the space of 9 days, Henry had lost both, his newborn daughter and the wife who had been his closest companion for 17 years. The double blow completed the emotional destruction that Arthur's death had begun, transforming the already cold king into something approaching a living corpse. Contemporary accounts of Henry's reaction to Elizabeth's death describe a man seemingly paralysed by grief and shock. Unlike his dramatic response to Arthur's death, Henry's reaction to losing his wife was characterised by complete withdrawal from human contact. He shut himself away for days, refusing to see anyone except his mother Margaret Beaufort, and when he finally emerged, courtiers noted that something fundamental had changed in his appearance and demeanour. The physical transformation was immediately visible to those who knew Henry well. His already thin frame became gaunt, his face took on a greyish pallor that would persist for the rest of his life, and his eyes acquired the cold, distant look of a man who had retreated completely from emotional engagement with the world around him. More disturbing still was his newfound inability to show even basic courtesy or warmth to longtime servants and supporters. The psychological impact of these losses on Henry's approach to kingship was immediate and profound. Having learned once again that love led only to devastating loss, he retreated into the emotional isolation that had characterized his youth, but which his marriage had briefly softened. The careful balance between political calculation and human sympathy that had marked his early reign disappeared entirely, replaced by a ruthless efficiency that brooked no consideration for individual suffering or sentiment. The question of remarriage that arose in the months following Elizabeth's death revealed the complete subordination of personal feeling to political calculation that now governed Henry's decisions. Various foreign princesses were evaluated solely on the basis of their potential to provide heirs and strengthen diplomatic alliances, with no apparent consideration for personal compatibility or the possibility of emotional connection. The negotiations that ensued were conducted with the same cold efficiency that characterized all of Henry's business, treating marriage as purely a matter of dynastic convenience. Henry's consideration of marriage to Joanna of Naples demonstrated just how thoroughly political calculation had displaced human feeling in his mind. The 27-year-old widow was evaluated primarily on her proven fertility and the diplomatic advantages her alliance might provide, while Henry's own emotional needs were apparently irrelevant to the decision-making process. The fact that these negotiations ultimately came to nothing reflected not romantic sentiment, but Henry's assessment that the political benefits did not justify the risks. The impact of Henry's emotional death on his relationship with his surviving children was perhaps the most tragic consequence of his losses. Prince Henry, now heir to the throne, found himself subjected to increasingly harsh criticism and micromanagement as his father attempted to mould him into a perfect successor. The warm, supportive relationship that might have developed between father and son was replaced by a cold tutorial in the demands of absolute power. Princess Margaret, married to King James IV of Scotland in 1503, experienced her father's emotional withdrawal at the very moment when she most needed his support and guidance. The 15-year-old girl who travelled north to her new kingdom carried with her the memory of a father who had once shown genuine affection, but who now seemed incapable of any feeling beyond political calculation. The transformation of Henry's court following Elizabeth's death reflected the broader changes in the king's personality and approach to rule. The relative warmth and ceremony that had characterized royal occasions during the Queen's lifetime gave way to a stark, business-like atmosphere where efficiency and profit took precedence over tradition or human comfort. Courtiers learned to approach their increasingly unpredictable sovereign with the caution they might have shown a dangerous animal. The king's relationship with his mother, Margaret Beaufort, became his only remaining source of emotional connection, though even this bond was shaped more by shared political interest than by genuine affection. Margaret's influence over her son increased dramatically after Elizabeth's death, as she became virtually his only trusted advisor and confidant. Yet even this relationship was characterized more by mutual utility than by the warmth that had once existed between Henry and his wife. The systematic elimination of potential rivals that characterized Henry's later years reflected not just political prudence, but a kind of emotional numbness that made him indifferent to the human cost of his decisions. The execution of the mentally disabled Earl of Warwick in 1499, carried out primarily to appease Spanish concerns about the succession, demonstrated Henry's complete subordination of mercy to political expediency. The development of increasingly sophisticated methods of financial extortion during Henry's final years represented both practical policy and psychological compensation for his emotional losses. Unable to form meaningful human relationships, Henry found a substitute satisfaction in the accumulation of wealth and the exercise of absolute power over his subjects' fortunes. The systematic impoverishment of the English nobility served both strategic and psychological purposes. The creation of an atmosphere of terror that characterized the final phase of Henry's reign reflected his transformation from a man seeking to build something positive to one focused primarily on preventing loss. Having experienced the devastating consequences of emotional investment, Henry resolved never again to allow himself to care about anything that could be taken away. The result was a kingdom ruled by fear rather than loyalty, efficient but ultimately hollow. As Henry entered the last decade of his life, he had achieved everything he had originally sought: security, wealth, dynastic continuity, and absolute power. Yet the methods required to achieve these goals, combined with the personal losses that had stripped away his humanity, left him ruling over a kingdom that feared rather than loved him. The cold-hearted king, who had begun his reign with genuine hopes for creating something better than mere survival, had become a living embodiment of the very qualities that had enabled his success but destroyed his capacity for happiness. The tragedy of Henry VII was not that he failed to achieve his goals, but that achieving them required him to sacrifice everything that might have made success worthwhile. The exile who had dreamed of returning home to claim his birthright had indeed become King of England, but in the process he had lost the very humanity that might have enabled him to enjoy his triumph. What remained was power without purpose, security without satisfaction, and a kingdom ruled by a man who had learned too well the lesson that survival required the death of love. The last decade of Henry VII's reign transformed England into a kingdom ruled by systematic terror, as the emotionally dead king channeled his grief and paranoia into an unprecedented campaign of financial extortion and political oppression. The man who had once sought merely to secure his dynasty now seemed determined to crush every potential source of resistance through the methodical application of legal violence and economic pressure. England experienced a form of government that was both brutally efficient and psychologically devastating, as Henry's brilliant administrative mind was turned toward the creation of a police state that would serve as a model for later Tudor absolutism. The appointment of Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson as the king's chief financial agents in 1504 marked the beginning of the most oppressive phase of Henry's reign. These men, both trained lawyers with flexible consciences and insatiable appetites for profit, became the instruments through which Henry's cold fury was directed against his subjects. Their methods combined legal sophistication with administrative ruthlessness, creating a system of oppression that was technically legitimate but practically indistinguishable from tyranny. Dudley, in particular, embodied the qualities that Henry now prized above all others: intelligence without sentiment, efficiency without mercy, and absolute loyalty to the crown. A graduate of Oxford with extensive experience in civil law, Dudley understood precisely how to manipulate England's legal system to generate maximum revenue while maintaining an appearance of justice. His appointment represented Henry's final abandonment of any pretense that royal government should balance profit with the welfare of subjects. The transformation of the Privy Chamber into a business operation under Dudley's supervision represented a fundamental shift in the nature of English monarchy. What had traditionally been the private apartments of the king became the headquarters of a systematic campaign to extract wealth from every possible source. Ancient laws that had been forgotten for generations were suddenly revived and enforced with devastating efficiency, while new interpretations of royal prerogatives created previously unknown sources of revenue. The revival of obsolete feudal obligations provided Dudley and Empson with a particularly rich source of extortion. Landowners who had held their estates unchallenged for generations suddenly found themselves accused of technical violations of feudal law that rendered their holdings forfeit to the crown. The only escape from complete ruin was the payment of enormous fines that often exceeded the value of the disputed properties, creating a system where royal mercy became just another commodity to be purchased at market rates. The systematic persecution of the merchant classes revealed Henry's understanding that England's growing commercial wealth represented the future of royal finance. Traders who had built their fortunes through careful adherence to existing laws suddenly found themselves retroactively guilty of infractions that required massive payments to the crown. The uncertainty created by these prosecutions discouraged commercial investment, while ensuring that successful merchants remained financially dependent on royal goodwill. The use of bonds and recognizances as instruments of control reached unprecedented levels during these final years, as Henry developed what was essentially a system of legal extortion that encompassed virtually every wealthy family in England. Nobles and merchants alike found themselves required to post surety for their future good behaviour, with the amount set so high that any subsequent offence would result in complete financial ruin. The psychological pressure created by these arrangements was often more effective than actual punishment in ensuring compliance with royal wishes. The expansion of the Court of Star Chamber into a regular tribunal for processing these financial persecutions provided Henry with a venue that combined the appearance of due process with the reality of predetermined outcomes. Defendants found themselves facing judges who were also royal creditors, prosecutors who were also beneficiaries of the fines imposed, and procedures that presumed guilt rather than innocence. The transformation of justice into a profit centre represented perhaps the most cynical aspect of Henry's later innovations. The development of a cadre of professional informers who were rewarded with percentages of the fines they helped generate created an atmosphere of universal suspicion that poisoned social relationships throughout England. Neighbours informed on neighbours, servants betrayed masters, and even family members found themselves unable to trust each other completely. The kingdom became a network of mutual surveillance, where everyone was simultaneously victim and potential victimizer. The targeting of sanctuary rights and traditional legal immunities demonstrated Henry's determination to eliminate every refuge from royal power. Churches that had provided sanctuary for centuries found their ancient privileges challenged in court, while guild rights and municipal freedoms were systematically eroded through legal challenges that few communities could afford to resist. The message was clear: no institution, however ancient or sacred, could provide protection from the king's financial demands. The use of retainers as evidence of treasonous intent provided Henry with a weapon against the traditional power of the nobility that was both legally sophisticated and practically devastating. Lords who maintained armed followers for legitimate purposes of estate management and local defence suddenly found themselves accused of preparing rebellion, with the only defence being the payment of ruinous fines. The traditional relationship between nobles and their dependents was criminalised, leaving the aristocracy isolated and vulnerable to royal pressure. The expansion of royal control over trade and commerce through the manipulation of customs duties and trading privileges created new opportunities for extortion, while undermining England's economic relationships with foreign partners. Merchants who had operated under established agreements for decades suddenly found their privileges revoked unless they agreed to substantially increased payments to the crown. The uncertainty created by these changes discouraged investment and innovation while maximising short-term royal revenue. The systematic corruption of local government through the appointment of royal commissioners who were compensated through the fines they imposed created a network of oppression that reached into every community in England. These officials, drawn largely from the legal profession and bound to the crown through financial incentives, transformed local administration from a service to the community into a mechanism for royal exploitation. The use of forced loans and benevolences provided Henry with additional tools for extracting wealth while maintaining the fiction that payments were voluntary. Wealthy subjects found themselves required to demonstrate their loyalty through generous contributions to royal projects, with refusal interpreted as evidence of disloyalty requiring investigation and punishment. The amounts demanded were calculated to inflict maximum financial damage while stopping just short of complete ruin. The targeting of testamentary dispositions and inheritance practices created a climate of uncertainty that extended even beyond death. Families found their carefully planned successions challenged by royal officials who discovered technical violations of increasingly complex regulations. The threat of posthumous financial persecution encouraged the living to maintain excessive reserves for potential royal demands while discouraging long-term planning and investment. The development of a sophisticated intelligence network that monitored not just political activities, but financial transactions created an atmosphere where no significant economic activity could occur without royal knowledge and potential interference. This surveillance extended to foreign trade, domestic commerce, and even private financial arrangements between individuals, creating a totalitarian level of state control over economic life. The physical deterioration of Henry himself during these years reflected the psychological cost of implementing such a system of oppression. Contemporary portraits show a man aged far beyond his years, with sunken eyes and a greyish complexion that suggested serious illness. Yet his mental faculties remained sharp, and his attention to the details of financial persecution never wavered, even as his body began to fail. The isolation of the king from normal human contact became almost complete during this period, as even long-time servants and supporters found themselves unable to approach him without fear of being subjected to investigation or demands for payment. Henry's court became a place of whispers and fear, where the smallest sign of royal displeasure could result in financial catastrophe. The irony of Henry's final years was that his success in creating this system of terror ultimately undermined its own effectiveness. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion that he had created made it increasingly difficult to distinguish between genuine threats and the paranoid fantasies that his isolation had begun to generate. The very efficiency of his oppression created enemies where none had existed before, while his financial demands eventually reached levels that threatened to provoke the very rebellions he sought to prevent. As Henry's health continued to decline through 1508 and early 1509, the question of succession became increasingly urgent. Prince Henry, now 18 and chafing under his father's restrictive supervision, represented both the hope for a more humane future and the possibility that the Tudor dynasty might abandon the very methods that had ensured its survival. The contrast between father and son became a source of hope for subjects who had learned to fear their sovereign's very existence. The death of Henry VII on April 21, 1509 at Richmond Palace was received throughout England with relief rather than grief. The man who had ended the Wars of the Roses and established one of history's most successful dynasties was mourned only by his mother and the small circle of officials who had profited from his system of oppression. For the vast majority of his subjects, the king's death represented liberation from a reign of terror that had transformed England into a kingdom ruled by fear rather than love. The immediate destruction of Henry's financial apparatus upon his son's accession demonstrated just how thoroughly the old king's methods had been rejected by the political nation. Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson were arrested within days of the new king's coronation and eventually executed, while many of the bonds and recognizances that had terrorized the nobility were cancelled or reduced. The new reign began with a deliberate repudiation of the financial terrorism that had characterized its predecessor. Yet the legacy of Henry VII's final years extended far beyond the immediate relief felt at his death. The administrative innovations, legal precedents, and bureaucratic structures created during his reign provided the foundation for the more sophisticated forms of royal absolutism that would characterize later Tudor rule. The methods might be abandoned, but the machinery of control remained, waiting to be employed by future monarchs who understood the relationship between information, intimidation, and power. The transformation of Henry VII from the calculating but still recognizably human king of his early years into the emotionally dead tyrant of his final decade represented one of history's most complete examples of how absolute power could corrupt even the most intelligent and capable rulers. The exile who had dreamed of creating a better England had instead created a kingdom ruled by systematic terror, demonstrating that the very qualities required for political survival could ultimately destroy the humanity that might have made survival worthwhile. As Henry's body was laid to rest beside his beloved Elizabeth in the magnificent chapel he had built at Westminster Abbey, England prepared to discover whether his son would continue the Tudor tradition of cold efficiency or return to the more traditional forms of monarchy that balance power with mercy. The reign of Henry VII was ending, but the legacy of his cold-hearted rule would shape English monarchy for generations to come. The death of Henry VII marked the end of one of the most remarkable transformations in English royal history, the evolution of a penniless exile into the founder of England's most successful dynasty. Yet the true measure of Henry's achievement lay not in the crown he had won or the wealth he had accumulated, but in the fundamental changes he had wrought in the very nature of English monarchy. The cold-hearted king who had learned to subordinate every human feeling to political necessity had created a new model of royal power that would influence rulers for centuries to come. The financial legacy of Henry's reign was perhaps his most immediately visible achievement. The treasury that had been virtually empty when he seized the throne in 1485 contained an estimated £1.8 million at his death, an enormous sum that made England one of the wealthiest kingdoms in Europe. This accumulation of wealth had been achieved not through conquest or lucky discoveries, but through the systematic application of administrative efficiency and financial innovation that transformed royal government from a feudal institution into a modern bureaucratic state. The methods Henry had developed for extracting revenue from his subjects represented a revolution in the relationship between crown and kingdom. The sophisticated system of bonds, recognizances, and legal prosecutions that he had perfected provided future monarchs with tools for controlling both the nobility and the merchant classes that were far more effective than traditional feudal obligations. The precedents he had established would be refined and expanded by his successors, creating the foundation for the absolutist monarchy that would characterize the Tudor century. The administrative innovations of Henry's reign extended far beyond mere revenue collection to encompass every aspect of royal government. The detailed record-keeping systems he had established, the professional bureaucracy he had created, and the legal mechanisms he had developed for enforcing royal will all contributed to a transformation of English monarchy from personal rule to institutional governance. These changes enabled the Crown to exercise unprecedented control over English society while maintaining the efficiency necessary to govern an increasingly complex kingdom. The intelligence and surveillance apparatus that Henry had constructed during his reign provided his successors with the most sophisticated tools for monitoring and controlling political opposition that had ever existed in England. The networks of informants, the systems for processing and analysing information, and the legal mechanisms for acting on intelligence reports all became permanent features of Tudor government. The paranoid vigilance that had enabled Henry's survival was institutionalised as a normal function of royal administration. The international reputation that Henry had built for England represented perhaps his most undervalued achievement. Through careful diplomacy, strategic marriages, and the demonstration of internal stability, he had transformed England from a war-torn kingdom on the periphery of European politics into a significant player in continental affairs. The respect that foreign powers showed for English sovereignty and the eagerness of European nobles to form marriage alliances with the Tudor dynasty testified to Henry's success in establishing his kingdom as a force to be reckoned with. The legal and constitutional precedents established during Henry's reign would influence English government long after the Tudor dynasty had ended. His use of parliamentary legislation to legitimise his rule, his development of prerogative courts to enforce royal will, and his expansion of royal jurisdiction into areas previously controlled by local authorities all contributed to the evolution of English law and government. The balance between royal power and traditional rights that he had achieved would be tested and refined by future generations. The cultural and architectural legacy of Henry's reign reflected his understanding that royal magnificence was an essential component of political authority. The chapel he had built at Westminster Abbey, the palaces he had constructed and renovated, and the artistic patronage he had provided all contributed to a renaissance of English culture that would reach its peak under his successors. The visual symbols of Tudor power that he had created helped establish the dynasty's legitimacy while demonstrating England's cultural sophistication to foreign observers. The religious settlement that Henry had maintained throughout his reign provided England with the stability necessary for economic and cultural development. By avoiding the religious controversies that plagued other European kingdoms, Henry had enabled England to focus its energies on internal development and external expansion. The traditional Catholic framework that he had preserved would be fundamentally altered by his son, but the precedent of royal control over religious affairs that Henry had established would prove crucial to the success of the English Reformation. The social changes that resulted from Henry's financial policies had transformed the relationship between crown and nobility in ways that would prove irreversible. The systematic impoverishment of the traditional aristocracy had weakened their ability to challenge royal authority while creating opportunities for new families to rise through royal service. The meritocratic elements that Henry had introduced into English government would be expanded by his successors, creating a more flexible and efficient system of administration. The psychological impact of Henry's reign on English political culture was perhaps his most profound legacy. The demonstration that royal power could be exercised through systematic application of law rather than mere force had changed expectations about the relationship between ruler and subject. The efficiency and predictability that had characterized Henry's government, despite its oppressive nature, had created new standards for royal performance that would influence how future monarchs were judged. The dynastic achievement that Henry had accomplished through his marriage to Elizabeth of York and the successful establishment of his son as heir represented the culmination of his life's work. The union of the rival claims that had torn England apart for decades provided the foundation for a stability that would enable England to become a major European power. The careful balance between Lancastrian and Yorkist legitimacy that Henry had maintained ensured that future Tudor monarchs would rule by undisputed right rather than mere conquest. The economic policies that Henry had pursued during his reign had laid the foundation for England's emergence as a major commercial power. His support for trade, his development of royal finances, and his creation of stable currency had all contributed to the growth of English commerce and the accumulation of capital that would fuel future expansion. The merchant classes that had suffered under his financial exactions had nevertheless benefited from the stability and international respect that his reign had brought to England. The military innovations that Henry had introduced, particularly his use of professional soldiers and his development of artillery, had modernised English warfare while providing his successors with the tools necessary for both internal control and external expansion. The yeoman of the guard that he had established as his personal bodyguard became the prototype for later developments in royal security, while his investment in naval capabilities provided the foundation for England's eventual maritime supremacy. The educational and cultural developments that had occurred during Henry's reign reflected his understanding that royal power in the modern world required more than mere force. The humanist scholars he had patronised, the schools he had supported, and the cultural exchanges he had facilitated with continental Europe all contributed to an intellectual renaissance that would culminate in the achievements of the Elizabethan age. The personal cost of Henry's achievements was measured not only in the humanity he had sacrificed, but in the isolation and suspicion that had characterised his final years. The emotional death that had followed the losses of Arthur and Elizabeth had transformed a calculating but still recognisably human ruler into something approaching a political machine. This transformation represented both the price of absolute power and the danger of subordinating all human values to political necessity. The moral legacy of Henry's reign would be debated by historians and political theorists for centuries to come. His defenders would argue that the stability and prosperity he had brought to England justified the harsh methods he had employed, while his critics would contend that no political achievement could excuse the systematic oppression of his subjects. The question of whether effective government required the sacrifice of traditional liberties would remain central to discussions of royal power throughout the early modern period. The technological and administrative innovations that Henry had introduced during his reign provided England with advantages that would prove crucial in the competitive environment of 16th century Europe. The efficient tax collection systems, the professional bureaucracy, and the sophisticated intelligence apparatus that he had created all gave England capabilities that rival kingdoms lacked. These advantages would be exploited by his successors to achieve military and diplomatic successes that might otherwise have been impossible. The religious and cultural unity that Henry had preserved during his reign provided his successors with a stable foundation for the dramatic changes that would characterise the Tudor century. The absence of the religious wars that plagued continental Europe during this period enabled England to focus its energies on expansion and development rather than internal conflict. The careful balance that Henry had maintained between innovation and tradition provided his son with the flexibility necessary to pursue more radical policies. The international alliances and diplomatic relationships that Henry had cultivated during his reign provided England with the external support necessary for independence and expansion. The marriage alliances he had negotiated, the commercial agreements he had concluded, and the military partnerships he had formed all contributed to England's emergence as a significant European power. The respect that foreign rulers showed for English sovereignty testified to Henry's success in establishing his kingdom's international legitimacy. As the cold winds of an English spring whistled through the windows of Richmond Palace, where Henry had drawn his last breath, they seemed to carry with them the echoes of a reign that had transformed not only England, but the very nature of monarchy itself. The exile who had returned with a handful of soldiers to claim an impossible throne had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, creating a dynasty that would rule England for over a century and establishing precedents for royal power that would influence European monarchy for generations. Yet the true measure of Henry VII's legacy lay not in the immediate benefits his subjects received or the wealth he had accumulated, but in the demonstration that human will, properly applied, could overcome any obstacle and achieve any goal. The boy who had fled England as a powerless refugee had returned as a conqueror, proving that intelligence, patience, and absolute determination could triumph over traditional sources of power and legitimacy. The cost of this achievement, measured in the humanity that Henry had sacrificed and the suffering he had inflicted on his subjects, served as a warning about the dangers of subordinating all human values to political necessity. The cold-hearted king who had ended the Wars of the Roses through marriage and manipulation had demonstrated both the possibilities and the perils of absolute power, leaving future generations to grapple with the question of whether effective government required the sacrifice of basic human sympathies. As the early morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of Westminster Abbey, illuminating the magnificent tomb where Henry lay beside his beloved Elizabeth, it seemed to offer a final judgment on the reign that had ended. The man who had learned to trust no one had found rest beside the woman who had provided his only genuine human connection. The king who had accumulated unprecedented wealth lay surrounded by the artistic magnificence that his patronage had created. The ruler who had established England's most successful dynasty rested in the chapel that testified to his vision of eternal glory. The cold-hearted king who had transformed England through sheer force of will had achieved a kind of immortality, not through the love of his subjects, but through the enduring impact of his innovations on the nature of English monarchy. Henry VII had died as he had lived, alone, suspicious, and emotionally isolated, but his legacy would shape England's destiny for generations to come. The Wars of the Roses were truly over, ended not by the sword but by the cold calculation of a king who had learned to subordinate every human feeling to the demands of political survival. In the quiet of that Westminster chapel, where the first Tudor king lay beside the last Yorkist princess, the long journey from exile to absolute power had finally reached its end. Henry Tudor had achieved everything he had dreamed of during his years of wandering: security, wealth, dynastic continuity, and historical significance. Yet the very methods that had brought him success had also ensured that he would be remembered not as a beloved monarch, but as England's most coldly efficient king, the man who had proven that political genius could achieve any goal, but could not restore the humanity that its exercise had destroyed. The reign of Henry VII was over, but the age of Tudor England was just beginning. The cold king's son would inherit not only a crown and a kingdom, but also the tools of power that his father had forged and the precedents for their use that his reign had established. Whether those tools would be employed with greater wisdom and humanity remained to be seen, but there could be no doubt that Henry Tudor, the exile who had become England's most calculating king, had changed the course of English history forever. As night settled over London and the fires burned low in the palace chambers, where courtiers whispered of the future that awaited them under a new king, the ghost of Henry VII seemed to linger in the corridors where he had walked with such cold purpose. The man who had learned to trust no one, love no one completely, and sacrifice any principle for political advantage, had finally found the peace that had eluded him throughout his life. The cold-hearted king who had ended the Wars of the Roses through marriage and manipulation had completed his transformation of England, and could rest at last in the knowledge that his dynasty was secure and his legacy assured. The long night of medieval monarchy was ending, and the dawn of the modern age was about to break over England. In that new world, the precedents that Henry VII had established, and the methods he had perfected, would be refined and expanded by monarchs who understood that power in the modern world required different tools than those that had served their predecessors. The cold king's greatest achievement was not the throne he had won, or the wealth he had accumulated, but the demonstration that intelligence and determination could triumph over any obstacle and achieve any goal. And so the story of Henry VII draws to its close, not with the warm affection of a beloved monarch mourned by grateful subjects, but with the cold respect accorded to a political genius whose achievements had transformed the very nature of English kingship. The exile who had returned with nothing but determination and intelligence had created a dynasty that would rule England for over a century, proving that in the ruthless world of medieval politics, sometimes the coldest heart could achieve the greatest triumphs. Sleep now, dear listener, and dream of those distant days when kings were made through calculation rather than birth, when crowns were won through intelligence rather than inheritance, and when the throne of England was claimed by a man whose greatest strength was his ability to subordinate every human feeling to the demands of political survival. The cold-hearted king who ended the Wars of the Roses has told his tale, and England sleeps under the Tudor rose that symbolised the union of enemies and the triumph of will over circumstance. Rest well, for tomorrow brings new tales of power and ambition, but tonight belongs to Henry VII, England's most coldly brilliant king.